The tension in the first-class cabin was suffocating. Passengers sat frozen, champagne glasses hovering mid-air, their gazes shifting between the flight attendant and the woman she had just humiliated. Ava Reynolds, the senior attendant, stood tall, her arms crossed, her polished smile barely masking the condescension in her voice. "I'm sorry, but we have to maintain the integrity of first class," she repeated, her tone dripping with false politeness. Madeline Carter, the woman in the sleek black suit, let the words hang in the air, unfazed. She exhaled slowly, then reached into her leather handbag, not for her phone, but for her phone. As a result of her own adventures, she tapped the screen once. The soft chime of a live-streaming app echoed in the stunned silence. "Ladies and gentlemen," she said, her voice calm, unwavering, carrying the quiet authority of someone used to commanding boardrooms, "I'd like to introduce you to Ava Reynolds, head flight attendant of this airline, who just attempted to remove a priority passenger from her own airline." Ava's face drained of color. The murmurs grew. Someone gasped. A well-dressed man in 2B nearly choked on his whiskey. "Her own airline," a hushed voice whispered. Madeline turned to Ava, tilting her head slightly, as if giving her one last chance to salvage what little dignity she had left. "Would you like to try that again? But before we dive deeper into this story, let me know, where are you watching from? Drop a comment below. And if you love stories like this, hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications so you never miss another jaw-dropping moment. The first-class cabin exuded an air of quiet opulence, a world within a world where time seemed to slow. Plush leather seats gleamed under the soft glow of ambient lighting, arranged in spacious pods designed for comfort and exclusivity. The scent of fresh linen and expensive cologne lingered faintly in the air, mixing with the subtle hum of the engines. A flight attendant in a neatly pressed uniform moved with effortless grace, offering champagne in slender crystal flutes to passengers who barely acknowledged her presence. Conversations were muted, the clink of glass and the rustle of designer bags the only interruptions in the otherwise serene atmosphere. It was the kind of luxury that whispered rather than shouted, an unspoken understanding that those who belonged here had no need to prove it. Madeline Carter stepped into this space with the kind of confidence that came from years of fighting for it. At 42, she had built an empire from the ground up, carving her place in an industry that had never been designed for her. She didn't drape herself in excessive jewelry or brand her power through ostentatious displays of wealth. Instead, she wore a sleek, tailored black suit that fit her frame with the kind of precision that suggested custom design. Her dark hair was pulled back in a simple yet elegant chignon, a few loose strands framing a face that was both composed and striking. There was an ease to the way she moved, a quiet authority that turned heads without demanding attention. She carried a single leather handbag, its craftsmanship impeccable but devoid of any loud designer logos. As she made her way down the aisle, there was a moment, a fraction of a second, where the atmosphere shifted. A few passengers glanced up, their eyes lingering just long enough to register surprise before looking away. She felt it, of course. She always did. It wasn't new, it wasn't unexpected, it was simply a part of the world she had learned to navigate. Ava Reynolds had spent years perfecting the art of control. At 35, she carried herself with the crisp efficiency of someone who had spent over a decade ensuring that every flight under her watch ran like clockwork. Her uniform was immaculate, her blonde hair pulled into a severe bun, her expression carefully curated to exude just the right balance of warmth and authority. She was good at her job. She knew how to handle difficult passengers, how to de-escalate tensions before they even had a chance to rise. But she also knew how to assess people, how to determine at a glance who belonged in first class and who had somehow slipped through the cracks. She prided herself on professionalism, but buried beneath the polished surface was something else, something sharper, something unspoken. When Heatherspot Julian, he asked the word so that if he said something was spoken, a set of quiet judgments made in the split second it took to scan a boarding pass, the way someone carried themselves, the way they dressed. And in that moment, as her eyes landed on Madeline Carter settling into seat 1A, something flickered in her expression, a hesitation, a calculation, a quick, almost imperceptible narrowing of her gaze. She approached the seat with measured steps, her heels clicking softly against the polished floor. "Ma'am, I think you're in the wrong section." Her tone was polite, perfectly neutral, but there was an undercurrent beneath it, something that suggested assumption rather than inquiry. Madeline barely reacted, merely lifting a brow as she glanced up from fastening her seatbelt. "I paid for this seat," she said simply, her voice calm, steady. She reached into her bag, her fingers brushing against the smooth leather of her boarding pass, but Ava didn't extend her hand to check it. She didn't even glance at it. Instead, she stood there, arms crossed in a way that felt just a little too deliberate. "First class is reserved for priority passengers," she said, her smile tight, measured. The words were carefully chosen, their meaning clear without needing to be stated outright. Madeline held her gaze, expression unreadable. She had seen this before. Different people, different settings, same story. She exhaled slowly, setting her boarding pass down on the tray table in front of her, an invitation for Ava to do her job, to verify, to confirm. But Ava hesitated, just long enough for the moment to stretch, for the tension to thicken into something undeniable. Around them, passengers shifted, some pretending not to hear, others watching with discreet interest. The cabin, for the first time since boarding, felt just a little less comfortable. "The first class is for priority passengers." Ava's voice carried a forced politeness, each syllable clipped and measured, but the meaning was sharp, intentional. The words weren't a simple clarification, they were a gate, a warning that some people simply didn't belong. The air inside the cabin shifted, tightening, growing heavy with an unspoken understanding. A few passengers in their reclining seats looked up from their champagne glasses, sensing something unspoken but familiar. Some exchanged brief glances before looking away, unwilling to be involved. Others pretended not to hear, flipping magazine pages or adjusting their noise-canceling headphones, suddenly very interested in anything other than the scene unfolding in front of them. Across the aisle, a young man in his mid-20s, dressed in a hoodie and ripped jeans, leaned back casually in his seat, his fingers moving instinctively toward his phone. Jake, a travel blogger known for capturing moments just like this, slowly lifted the device, his expression neutral but his lens trained on the interaction. He had an eye for these things, for the subtle moments when a person's mask slipped, when a situation turned into something bigger than a simple misunderstanding. His viewers loved content like this, raw, unfiltered moments of power and injustice. And this had potential. Madeline didn't react the way Ava expected. No sharp inhale, no flash of indignation, no immediate protest. She simply blinked once, slow and deliberate, as if filing away the words for later examination. Then, in a movement so effortless it felt rehearsed, she reached into her bag and pulled out a sleek black notebook, the kind executives used in meetings where decisions worth millions were made. She set it on her tray table with quiet precision, then clicked open a pen. "Go on," she said, her tone impossibly calm. "I'm taking notes." Ava stiffened, her shoulders squaring as if physically bracing herself. The shift was almost imperceptible, but those who were paying attention felt it. The sudden recalibration, the understanding that the dynamic had changed. It wasn't just about a seat anymore. It wasn't just about a mistake. It was about control, about authority, about who had the right to dictate the rules and who was expected to follow them without question. Richard Dalton, a man who had spent decades in high-stakes finance, sat forward slightly in his seat. He had been watching the exchange with mild curiosity at first, the way one observed a minor inconvenience, but now his interest was fully piqued. He knew power when he saw it, and he recognized what was happening here. The way the flight attendant had spoken, the way she had hesitated before checking the boarding pass, the way she had chosen her words so carefully. It was all too familiar. He had sat in boardrooms where men had done the same thing to their colleagues, dressing their dismissal in professionalism, using coded language to push someone out without ever making it explicit. He knew a test when he saw one, and he knew Madeline Carter was about to pass with flying colors. Ava's jaw tightened as she glanced down at the notebook, as if weighing whether or not to push forward. The tension had spread now, passengers sitting a little straighter, sensing that this moment was turning into something bigger than just a seating dispute. She could feel their eyes on her, waiting to see what she would do next, and that only made it worse. "Mom, I need you to move," she said again. This time her voice just a fraction sharper, her carefully maintained professionalism starting to fray at the edges. Madeline tilted her head slightly, studying her as if Ava were an equation she was working through in real time. "I already told you," she said, voice as smooth as silk. "I belong here." The silence that followed wasn't the kind that drifted unnoticed. It was the kind that pressed in, the kind that made people hyper-aware of every breath, every shift in movement, the kind of silence that made clear that whatever happened next would be remembered. Jessica lingered a few feet away, her fingers fidgeting at the hem of her uniform, eyes darting between Ava and Madeline. She looked uneasy, as if she could feel the weight of the moment pressing down on her, but she said nothing. Her mouth opened slightly, like she wanted to interject, but the words never came. Instead, she shifted on her feet, her hesitation almost painful to watch. She wasn't blind to what was happening. It was written all over her face, the silent conflict, the awareness that this wasn't about a simple seat dispute. She had seen Ava operate long enough to know exactly what this was, but knowing was one thing, stepping in was another. She flicked a quick glance toward the galley as if hoping for backup, but no one was coming, not yet, not unless she made a move. The seconds stretched, thick with indecision. Then, finally, another figure stepped into the growing tension. Lucas. The male flight attendant had been watching from the background, standing near the beverage cart, his expression unreadable. Where Jessica hesitated, he acted. With a firm, professional stride, he closed the space between them and extended his hand. "Let's check the ticket," he said, his voice neutral but carrying enough authority that Ava couldn't ignore him. Madeline, still calm, still composed, picked up her boarding pass and handed it over with a slow, deliberate motion. Lucas took it, his eyes scanning the details, and for the first time in the entire exchange, someone was actually doing their job. His brows furrowed slightly as he double-checked the seat assignment. Then, with a measured inhale, he handed it back. "Her seat is confirmed," he said simply, but his voice carried something heavier. An unspoken correction, a statement not just for Madeline, but for Ava as well. Ava's jaw clenched so tightly the muscle in her cheek twitched. She didn't even glance at the ticket, didn't acknowledge it. Instead, she kept her eyes locked on Lucas, her lips parting as if searching for an argument. But there was none. Not a valid one, at least. Across the aisle, Richard Dalton shifted slightly in his seat, just enough to make his presence known. He had seen enough boardroom battles to know when someone was losing ground, and Ava was losing fast. His gaze flicked between them, taking in the way Lucas had subtly but effectively dismantled the argument in one move. He didn't say a word, but his slight nod, his calculated stillness, made one thing clear. He knew exactly what was happening, and he wasn't impressed. Ava inhaled sharply, trying to force herself back into control. "Then I'll have security handle this upon landing." The words came out clipped, forced, a last-ditch effort to maintain authority, but the moment they left her lips, the atmosphere inside the cabin shifted again, this time with a sharper edge. A murmur rippled through first class, a subtle but undeniable reaction to the escalation. This was no longer just an uncomfortable interaction. This was something else. Something passengers would remember. Madeline, still utterly composed, still unshaken, finally moved in a way that made Ava's stomach tighten. She reached for her phone, lifted it slightly, and pressed the screen. The soft chime of the camera starting was quiet, but in the weighted silence of the cabin, it might as well have been deafening. Passengers exchanged looks. Some turned their bodies slightly, as if making the conscious choice to witness this unfold. Jake, the vlogger, subtly adjusted his angle, making sure his own camera was capturing everything. Ava's fingers curled into her palms. She had been in difficult situations before, had dealt with entitled first-class passengers who thought the rules didn't apply to them. But this was different. This wasn't someone making ridiculous demands. This was someone exposing the very moment she had overplayed her hand. And worst of all, there were too many eyes watching now for her to take it back. A sudden jolt rocked the cabin, sending a ripple of unease through the passengers. A few gasps escaped as drinks trembled on tray tables, ice clinking against the glass. The overhead lights flickered for a brief second before stabilizing. It wasn't severe turbulence, just enough to remind everyone that they were 35,000 feet in the air, completely dependent on forces outside their control. Hands instinctively gripped armrests, bodies stiffened. The moment of weightlessness passed as quickly as it arrived, but the tension it left behind didn't dissipate. Ava, who had been standing too rigidly, lost her balance for half a second, her foot slipping slightly as she steadied herself against a seat. Her frustration, already simmering beneath the surface, flared. Her breath came out sharply, a quiet but unmistakable exhale of irritation. And then she said it. "You people always think you can do whatever you want." The words were barely more than a mutter, low enough that she might have thought they would go unnoticed. But the silence that followed told her otherwise. Jessica inhaled sharply, the sound small but weighted with shock. Her eyes flicked toward Madeline, toward the passengers around them, her lips parting as if she wanted to undo what had just happened, to take the words back for Ava because she knew Ava wouldn't. Her fingers twisted in the fabric of her uniform, her knuckles turning white, her entire body suddenly too stiff, too aware. Across the aisle, Richard's posture changed. His easy composure evaporated, his jaw tightening, his expression turning cold. The kind of cold that didn't come from surprise, but from recognition. From a lifetime of seeing people like Ava say things like this and never facing the consequences. His fingers drummed against the armrest once, a single measured beat. His gaze now fully locked on Ava, no longer just a passive observer. Jake, still holding his phone, whispered into his mic, "Did y'all hear that?" His eyes darted toward the screen, making sure he had captured it. He had. He knew he had. And now, so would the rest of the world. Madeline remained still, her fingers resting lightly on her tray table. She didn't stiffen, didn't react in the way Ava might have expected. Instead, she slowly, methodically, unfastened her seatbelt and rose to her feet. The movement was unhurried, precise, calculated. She didn't loom over Ava, didn't attempt to make a spectacle of it. She simply stood, her presence alone commanding the attention of every single person watching. "Would you like to repeat that?" Her voice was quiet, smooth, absent of anger, but filled with something far more dangerous. Ava's face lost all color. A deep, steady voice cut through the silence like a blade. "What seems to be the problem here?" The authority in it was undeniable, the kind that made people instinctively straighten their backs and second-guess their decisions. The tension in the cabin seemed to shift, not dissipating but realigning as passengers turned their heads toward the source of the voice. Captain David Clark stood at the front of the aisle, his uniform crisp, his posture relaxed but unmistakably in control. He wasn't the type to raise his voice or make a scene. He didn't need to. His presence alone was enough to command attention. Ava's entire body went rigid. She hadn't expected this. Hadn't expected him to step in. Her hands smoothed down the front of her uniform as if that alone could compose her, her lips parting slightly, but no words came out immediately. Madeline remained standing, her expression unreadable, her hands still resting at her sides. She didn't turn to the captain right away, instead keeping her eyes locked on Ava, waiting. Jessica exhaled shakily, stepping back as if she wanted to disappear from the moment entirely. Lucas, however, took a single step forward. "Captain, I checked her ticket. It's valid." The words landed heavily, final, a hammer striking down with the weight of truth. Captain Clark's gaze sharpened as he turned to Ava, his expression remaining neutral but his eyes carrying something colder. "You made a mistake," he said, his voice firm but calm. "And you escalated it instead of correcting it." Ava's breath hitched. She opened her mouth, closed it again. Her gaze flickered to Lucas, to Jessica, searching for some kind of support, but there was none. Even the passengers, the very people she had assumed would side with her, were watching her with varying degrees of disapproval, discomfort, and something even worse, indifference. She swallowed hard, grasping for a justification, for anything that might undo what had already been done. "Captain, I was just trying to ensure the integrity of first class." "The integrity of first class?" Clark repeated, his tone carrying the weight of barely restrained patience. "By attempting to remove a passenger with a valid ticket?" Ava's mouth snapped shut. The recording phones were still pointed at her. She could feel them even without looking. She could feel the weight of this moment, the realization settling in her stomach like a cold stone. She had lost. And now, everyone watching knew it. "Ladies and gentlemen, please remain seated. Airport personnel will board shortly." The captain's voice came over the intercom, steady and controlled, but beneath the professionalism was an unmistakable finality. The murmurs started instantly. Passengers shifted in their seats, glancing around with expressions ranging from curiosity to anticipation. Some turned to their seatmates, whispering theories, while others kept their eyes forward, unwilling to admit they were just as invested in the outcome. Madeline remained still, not bothering to react. She knew exactly what was coming. This wasn't a delay. This wasn't a routine protocol. This was the moment Ava had been trying to avoid since the second she realized she had lost. Ava, however, still clung to denial. Her hands pressed against the fabric of her uniform, smoothing it down, as if that small act of control could undo everything unraveling around her. Her gaze darted to the captain, then to Lucas, then to Jessica, searching for an escape, an ally, someone to salvage what was left of her dignity. But no one spoke. No one moved. She was alone. The door at the front of the cabin opened, and two uniformed officers stepped inside. Ava's breath caught in her throat. For the first time, she looked afraid. The officers didn't hesitate. They didn't pause to ask questions or allow room for explanations. They had already been briefed. They knew why they were here. One of them, a man with a sharp gaze and a firm stance, stepped forward. His voice was calm, but there was no mistaking the authority behind it. "Miss Reynolds, you need to come with us." The silence in the cabin was deafening. Ava didn't move. For a brief second, she looked as though she might argue, might make one final desperate attempt to regain some control over the situation. But then she saw them. The phones. Everywhere she turned, someone was recording. Passengers who had pretended to be uninterested before were now openly watching. Some of them had their cameras raised, capturing every moment, ensuring that this, her downfall, her humiliation, would not be forgotten. The officer stepped closer. "Miss Reynolds," he repeated, quieter this time but no less firm. Ava inhaled sharply, blinking rapidly, her chest rising and falling in quick, uneven breaths. Then, slowly, she forced her feet to move. She stepped away from the galley, each movement stiff and mechanical, as if her body was rejecting what was happening. Her head was high, her expression unreadable, but her eyes betrayed her. There was no control left, no power, just the crushing weight of realization. As she walked down the aisle, passing row after row of passengers, no one spoke. But then, a single clap, soft, then another, and another. The sound spread through the cabin, hesitant at first, then gaining momentum, until it was unmistakable. It wasn't thunderous. It wasn't a standing ovation. It was something quieter, sharper, something that carried an understanding deeper than words. Ava kept walking, her shoulders tight, her hands curled into fists at her sides. She didn't look at anyone. She didn't dare. She reached the exit, and the moment she stepped off the plane, it was over. The tension in the cabin released, not all at once, but in gradual waves. Passengers exhaled, shifted in their seats, resumed their conversations, but the atmosphere had changed. Jessica lingered for a moment near Madeline's row, her fingers curled lightly around the edge of the beverage cart. Her face was tight with emotion. Guilt, shame, something more. She swallowed hard, then leaned in just slightly, her voice quiet enough that only Madeline could hear. "I'm sorry." Madeline met her gaze, searching her face for a second longer than necessary, then nodded once. Jessica hesitated, then turned, pushing the cart forward. The flight continued, but nothing about it would be the same. Madeline stood, adjusting the strap of her bag with slow precision, her movements controlled, unhurried. The tension had settled now, not entirely gone, but transformed into something heavier, something unspoken yet deeply understood. As she stepped into the aisle, she glanced back once, just for a moment. Ava wasn't looking at her. She wasn't looking at anyone. She stood near the galley, her posture still stiff, but the energy around her was different now, no longer the rigid confidence of authority, but something deflated, something crumbling under the weight of exposure. Her gaze was fixed downward, her hands still clenched at her sides, as if willing herself to disappear. There was no last glare, no attempt at defiance, just silence. Madeline didn't say anything. She didn't need to. She turned and walked toward the exit, her heels clicking softly against the polished floor, the only sound in a cabin that had yet to recover from what had just unfolded. Passengers murmured, some leaning in toward each other, quietly replaying the moment in hushed tones. Some still held their phones, scrolling through the footage they had captured, their thumbs hovering over the screen as if deciding whether to post, to share, to spread the story further than the confines of this plane. It wasn't just an incident anymore. It was something bigger. Jake, still seated, exhaled slowly, shaking his head slightly before lowering his phone. His fingers moved quickly, a few taps, a brief caption typed out, and then he hit upload. The video was already spreading before the plane even reached the gate. He knew what would happen next. He had seen it before. The comments, the outrage, the calls for accountability. But this wasn't just about Ava. This was about something deeper, something that had played out in different places, in different ways, over and over again. For some people, this was just another flight. Just another uncomfortable moment they would forget once they stepped off the plane. But for others, this would stay with them. A shift, small but undeniable, an awareness that couldn't be ignored. Because for the first time, they saw it. And once you see it, you can't unsee it. She never raised her voice. She never needed to. The truth spoke for itself. Madeline Carter didn't have to argue, didn't have to prove anything. She didn't fight with words or plead for recognition. She didn't beg for validation or try to justify her presence. She simply existed where she was meant to be. And that was enough to make people uncomfortable. That was enough to make some question whether she truly belonged. But the thing about truth is that it doesn't need permission. It doesn't need to shout to be heard. It doesn't require aggression to make an impact. It lingers, undeniable, pressing down until it forces people to confront it. What happened on that plane wasn't new, it wasn't shocking. It was just another moment in a long pattern, one that people either choose to see or pretend isn't there. But this time, there were witnesses. This time it was captured, documented, impossible to ignore. Madeline didn't demand respect. She commanded it. And in doing so, she exposed the quiet, everyday injustices that so often go unchecked. Ava Reynolds didn't lose because she was outmatched in an argument. She lost because she exposed herself, because she underestimated the weight of her own prejudice, because she believed she could dictate who belonged and who didn't. But the thing about power is that it shifts, and when people start paying attention, when they stop looking away, when they start calling it out for what it is, that's when real change happens. And now it's your turn to decide. Have you ever witnessed discrimination firsthand? Maybe it wasn't on a plane, maybe it was in a restaurant, a store, a workplace, maybe it was subtle, a quiet dismissal, a glance that lingered just a second too long. Did you say something? Did you speak up? Or did you let it slide, tell yourself it wasn't your place, that it wasn't a big deal? What would you have done if you were on that plane? Would you have looked away, shifted uncomfortably in your seat, hoped someone else would handle it? Or would you have spoken, challenged it, risked making yourself part of the moment instead of just an observer? Do enough people speak up in these moments? Or do we let them pass, pretend they don't matter, tell ourselves it's not our fight? Because here's the thing, silence is complicity. And every time we stay silent, every time we let it happen without consequence, we allow it to continue. So what will you do next time? Drop your thoughts in the comments below. Let's talk about it. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more inspiring stories of courage and change. Every time we speak up, every time we challenge injustice, we push the world a little closer to what it should be. A place where respect isn't conditional, where dignity isn't a privilege, and where no one has to justify their right to exist in spaces they've earned. This isn't just about one flight, one confrontation, or one person who thought they had the power to decide who belongs. It's about a system, about patterns that have gone unchecked for too long. It's about the moments that make people stop and ask themselves hard questions. It's about what happens when someone finally says, "No, not this time." And it doesn't end here, because for every Ava, there's a Madeline. For every injustice, there's someone willing to stand firm, to let the truth speak for itself. The question is, will you be that person? Will you be the one who speaks up? Will you refuse to look away the next time you see someone being treated as if they are less than what they are? Change isn't always loud. Sometimes it's as simple as bearing witness. Sometimes it's refusing to back down. And sometimes it's knowing that justice doesn't always come in the way people expect, but it always comes. Together, we can create a world where everyone's dignity is recognized and respected, where silence doesn't let prejudice thrive, where power is not about control, but about integrity, where people don't just believe in justice, they make it happen. So what will you do the next time you see a moment like this? Will you be a bystander, or will you be part of the change? Let us know in the comments below, and remember, every voice matters, including yours.